Matthew Matoses fundamentally misunderstands the Souls games, and this fact is made abundantly clear in his video titled The Lost Soul Arts of Demon Souls, in which he tries to make the point that Demon Souls was unique and innovative, while both the Dark Souls trilogy and Bloodborne were comparatively soulless and derivative, and provided few improvements or meaningful changes to the formula created by their original predecessor, while often introducing regressive mechanics. Anyone who's familiar with From Software's games will feel painfully frustrated upon watching the video. Matthew's modus operandi consists of making biased, and often blatantly false assertions, which he doesn't substantiate, ad nauseum, until the mind of the viewer has rotted from the constant exposure to bad faith arguments. Matthew Matoses is not some random YouTuber. He is, perhaps, one of the most influential video game critics in the platform's history, and his most popular videos are those in which he talks about the Souls games. They've helped shape the popular understanding of these games, so much so that to this day, you can see terrible arguments which he made in his videos being repeated uncritically, tirelessly so. As such, this counter-critique is long overdue. Each of his points will be thoroughly addressed and refuted. Unlike him, I will amply substantiate each of mine. I'll allow his arguments to be presented in full before responding, so that it's clear I'm not misrepresenting any of them. But before proceeding with that, I'll quickly prove Matthew is far from knowledgeable and qualifies to meaningfully critique the Souls games, by providing a rebuke of some of his dishonest arguments and objectively false statements about them, which he espoused in his critique of Dark Souls 2.
As soon as you get to Medulla, there's even a counter tracking the number of deaths. You can also go online and see a full breakdown of the ways people have died.
Demon Souls features a death counter in its hub area as well, and it also exposes to you the deaths of other players.
It's not just the level-by-level design which suffers in Dark Souls 2 compared to other installments, it's the accessibility of different areas and the placement of many items too. This is another reason why comparisons between the design of Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2 are insulting to the former. In Demon Souls, once the player finished the first stage of Boletaria, they then had 5 levels immediately available for them at any point.
Dark Souls 2 is actually the least linear game in the trilogy, and it is also less linear than Demon Souls. In Demon Souls, its optional tutorial accepted, you are forced to clear the first area of Boletaria Castle, before accessing the other Arkstones.
Hunting for demons? Try one of the Arkstones. Now go.
And then you can only enter the first areas, and the second area of the first one. The first boss you'll encounter will always be Phalanx, and the second will always be either the Tower Knight or the first boss of the other Arkstones. In Dark Souls 2, you can do almost any area that isn't gated by the Shrine of Winter, or by one of the 4 old ones, as your first, second, or, at most, third, and there is more than a dozen of them. Acquiring the Cat Ring is incredibly easy, and can be done without killing a single boss. Even Drunglake Castle can be accessed early, by fulfilling the alternative requirement of the Shrine of Winter, which is to accumulate 1 million soul memory. There are 10 possibilities for a first boss encounter: the Last Giant, the Pursuer, the Old Dragon Slayer, the Dragon Rider, the Royal Rat Vanguard, Najka, the Rotten, and the Twin Dragon Riders, both of which are mid-game boss fights, Hava, which is a DLC boss, and even the Dark Lurker, which is a secret endgame boss. Imagine if you could fight the Nameless King as your first boss in Dark Souls 3, or Ebrietas in Bloodborne.
Each level had different pros and cons. There were incentives to go to any of them, except arguably the swamp, but even then the player isn't blocked from exploring the swamp if they wish. Item placement in Demon Souls was carefully balanced to give each world a reasonably fair share of useful items which players would eventually be aware of for subsequent playthroughs. Dark Souls 1 attempted to carry on this legacy but did a somewhat worse job. There were several areas available right from the start, but not as much incentive to go to them.
Were there less incentives to go to middle or late game areas at the start of a playthrough in Dark Souls than in Demon Souls? Did Dark Souls do a worse job? Is doubling your flask capacity, or getting one of the best weapons for the first game cycle, the Gravelord Sword, not a good incentive to explore the catacombs early? You can complete the area very easily as an experienced player by using intended scoops, and Pinwheel is not just easy, he can be soloed by Paladin Leroy. Here is a clip of me completing the catacombs with a fresh character. Leroy managed to kill Pinwheel before I was able to hit him a single time. The boss drops 15,000 souls, the Rite of Kindling, 1 humanity, and a homeward bone, which allows me to return to the shrine scot-free and level my character 13 times. He also drops 1 of 3 masks, each having a very useful special effect. He's going to the Darkroot Basin early, to guess the Grosscrest Shield, and potentially the Black Knight Halberd, the strongest twinkling weapon, less useful than, say, going to the Shrine of Storms to guess the Crescent Falchion.
In Dark Souls 2, Majula only opens into 2 locations at the beginning, but the sad thing is it actually connects to 5. The Grave of Saints, Huntsman's Copse and Shaded Woods are all sealed off until the player completes at least some of the other areas, or gathers up around 12,000 souls to buy the Cat Ring. There's no good reason why this should be the case, other than trying to ensure inexperienced players end up starting on the right path. That might seem like a harmless compromise to make, but the Souls games are supposed to be a refuge from the crippling accessibility concessions many other modern games make. Dark Souls 2 doesn't seem to have as much trust in the player. This has an adverse effect on multiple playthroughs of the game since they all start out the same way. The layout of Demon Souls, and to a lesser extent Dark Souls 1, allowed you to start a new game and quickly build whatever character you liked. Instead of carrying on this tradition, Dark Souls 2 railroads the player at the beginning and only opens up more later on. There's a serious lack of useful equipment in the first half of the game, which becomes doubly problematic since players are going to waste Titanite and souls on weapons they're not very attached to, simply because they don't have any other options.
His point about the gear and the placement of items is stupefyingly incorrect. I'll prove it through a comparison. Defining Demon Souls' early game has the tutorial, the first area of each Arkstone, and the second area of the first one. It features 38 weapons and 10 spells. Among them there are 4 special weapons, which you can find already enhanced and infused. Defining Dark Souls 2's early game has places you can go to before killing 3 out of its 41 bosses, not counting DLCs, nor the Drunglake Castle and beyond, and also excluding boss weapons, even though you can get them much more easily and earlier than in Demon Souls, as well as Covenant rewards. It features 66 weapons and 5 additional infused weapon variants. The infused weapons do not come enhanced, as in Demon Souls, but it's exponentially easier and cheaper to upgrade weapons in Dark Souls 2. You can even obtain a fully upgraded weapon before killing a single boss, no glitches involved. Most of the weapons which are considered meta for PvE can be acquired in the early game. In Demon Souls it can be almost impossible to fully upgrade a weapon, depending on the selected infusion, and it's quite painful to enhance more than 1 or 2 weapons through the same upgrade path in a playthrough. Unlike in Dark Souls 2, where nearly every material is easy to obtain, plentiful, and even farmable. As for early game spells, Dark Souls 2 features 11 hexes, 12 pyromancies, 15 sorceries, and 16 miracles, totaling 54, and only 3 among the 54 spells acquirable early on require above average or high stats to use.
Dark Souls 2 just haphazardly places massive enemies all over the place. Dealing with multiple strong enemies like this comes across as a hassle rather than an interesting fight, which encourages players to use cheap tactics instead of playing fair.
The encounter with the pair of Primal Knights at the Starway to Drunglake Castle is a deliberate reference to the encounter with the pair of Giant Sentinels at the Starway to Underlondo of Dark Souls 1. Furthermore, Demon Souls has a fair share of similarly difficult, multi-enemy encounters, some of them much more unfair than those of Dark Souls 1 and 2.
The mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one engagements, thanks to its slow attack animations which are uninterruptible once they start, and a lock-on camera which focuses heavily on a single foe.
This is glaringly false. The first non-tutorial boss of Demon Souls is a multi-enemy fight. Would From Software choose to start the first Souls game with such a fight, if they weren't confident in their combat system working in such scenarios? The vast majority of non-boss enemy encounters of the series feature multiple enemies. On screen is a run-through from the Firelink Shrine to the first bonfire of the Undead Burg to prove it. Just because you're bad at handling multiple enemies and can't manage the lock-on properly, doesn't mean the combat was designed for, or works uniquely in one-on-one encounters. You can even switch targets by tapping the analog stick. The only From Software title to truly focus on fights against a singular enemy is Sekiro.
Enemy designs in general are a big step down from Dark Souls 1. Nearly all of them are humanoids with similar movesets. The vast majority that don't conform to that style were all present in Dark Souls 1. Basilisks, wheel skeletons, giant rats, mimics and necromancers all originate from the first game. By comparison, Dark Souls 2 brings almost nothing new to the table.
Dark Souls 2 features the same number of new, non-humanoid creatures as Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2's base game features ogres, kobolds, pigs and boars, flame lizards, dark stalkers, giant dogs, undead aberrations, poison moths, poison beetles, dark suckers, crag sleepers, spiders and more. Not counting the DLCs, there are nearly 20 new creatures in Dark Souls 2 that, just to clarify, were not present in Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 had around 20 of them as well, depending on what you consider distinct enough from a humanoid. Dark Souls 2 as a whole has 40 to 50 more enemies than its predecessor.
Similarly, I decided it wouldn't make sense for me to join a covenant without having an understanding of what that covenant was about. I mean, if I came up to you on the street and asked you to join my organisation without explaining what it was, it would be a bad idea to accept my proposal. This was my chief problem with the covenants in Dark Souls 1, and nothing has been done to correct it in Dark Souls 2. Take the Company of Champions, for example. The player walks up to a big stone tablet and is immediately prompted to join the covenant without any explanation.
The exact covenant he used as an example to substantiate his claim is explained by the wise Cheshire Cat NPC that is located in the same area as the rock. And the game made sure to add one more prompt than usual for when one is to join this covenant, to make sure that even the most inattentive, dim-witted players understand that it will make the game more challenging. That's enough to prove Matthew is severely misinformed about the topics he's addressing, and heavily biased, if not outright dishonest. Oh, and one last thing. Before you accuse me of being biased in my response, know that, for a long time, I claimed Demon's Souls was my favorite game of all time. I love it immensely, and don't think it is in any way worse than its many successors. I am not partial against it. I've made a 2-hour-long video about its masterfully written story, and a comprehensive critique of its terrible Bluepoint remake. With that said, I'll start the critique of Matthew's essay.
Dark Souls. It's a game and a series that needs no introduction, so I haven't bothered to write one. Instead, I'm going to get straight to the point. As much as these games have been revered and discussed to death, it seems to me as though the actual origin of the series has all but been forgotten, and I don't just mean by the community. Many of the merits and ideals of Demon's Souls have faded away in the following entries, starting even as early as the original Dark Souls. After Demon's Souls was a surprise hit, FromSoft set out to make it again, only this time bigger and better. In many ways, Dark Souls was an ambitious sequel. The world was much larger and interconnected, which added a whole new satisfaction to exploration. The inability to warp from one area to another forced players into lengthy journeys, giving the game a sense of isolated adventure that even Demon's Souls couldn't offer. The animations were more polished, with even more of that satisfying weight that the series is known for. There were a bunch of refinements to the formula, like Estus, which removed potential downtime and helped balance out the challenge. It even had a few completely new mechanics of its own, like Covenants. I think it's a great sequel, and judging by its phenomenal success, it seems that many other people agree. There is one important caveat though. It's not innovative. Many of the notable features that people assign to Dark Souls originated in Demon's Souls and were simply brought across because they worked last time. The goal of Dark Souls wasn't innovation, it was refinement. FromSoft already had a formula that worked, and they set out to exploit that fact.
He at first heavily implies, and will outright argue, and claim throughout the video that Demon's Souls was highly inventive and experimental, and that From Software became less and less innovative with each subsequent title, that every spiritual successor to it was creatively stale, that the passionate and talented developers of From Software forgot about Demon's Souls and not made it good and special. He immediately contradicts himself, frustratingly so, by laying out some of the most significant innovations Dark Souls brought to the formula established by Demon's Souls. I will address them one by one, as to show just how bad and contradictory his opening argument is. Dark Souls introduced to the series a brilliantly realized interconnected world, which was not just innovative in relation to its predecessor, but to gaming as a whole. The closest thing we had to Dark Souls 1's world design was the Kingsfield and Shadow Tower series, and maybe a few games from the Metroid, Castlevania, and Zelda series, but those were very different, unfathomably simpler and shorter, and two-dimensional for the most part. And to this day, outside of From Software, there are at best a couple games that have managed to emulate it beyond a mildly competent degree. This innovation alone is more than enough to disprove Matthew's arguments, but it's merely the top of an iceberg. The inability to warp between areas until the player reaches the middle of the game is also remarkable and very risky, as complaints about the lack of fast travel were sure to come. Dark Souls fully reworked the healing system of Demon Souls through the bonfires and the Estus Flask, which solved a few major issues, such as players having to farm for healing items, players having access to piles of easily obtainable healing items, thus trivializing exploration, new game plus cycles not adjusting item prices, nor removing the healing items from the player's inventory, meaning they'll start the game with a ton of them, and more. The Estus and bonfire mechanics fundamentally changed the way players interacted with the formula, in more ways than I will list in this point. This doesn't mean other games can't have different systems, nor that they shouldn't dare to experiment, or even try refining that of Demon Souls. Matthew quickly glances over many innovative mechanics introduced in Dark Souls, only mentioning the Covenant system. I will list some of them that weren't already mentioned, and their contributions to the formula, and also explain why the Covenant system is a very significant innovation. The Covenant system added a whole new dimension to online interaction. The Forest Hunters Covenant introduced the concept of a PvP-focused area, as players who stepped deep into the Darkroot Garden had open to special invasions, which rewards the invaders not with the Dark Souls equivalents to ephemeral ice stones, but, primarily, with a variety of upgrade materials. The Warriors of Sunlight Covenant incentivized cooperation by providing players with a new branch of offensive miracles, the 3 types of lightning spears. The Path of the Dragon inspires dueling, and provides the players with a new mechanic in the Dragon transformation. The Gravelord Servants Covenant was a weird and experimental mechanic, in which players who are in the second game cycle and beyond can be cursed, effectively making them experience a hardcore difficulty mode for the game, until the player cursing them is defeated, and all recipients of the curse can join his rolls to challenge him. The curse comes out of nowhere, at no fault of the target, and there is no way to block it. It was a rather risky, potentially controversial mechanic to implement. The Blades of the Dark Moon Covenant hunted down invaders and other sinners with blue-eye orbs to obtain the strongest buff in the game, the Dark Moon Blade, etc. Covenants also served to embolden the role-playing aspect of Dark Souls. Players could now act in affiliation with characters from the game. Dark Souls introduced plunging attacks, a significant addition to the player's moveset, while simultaneously adding more verticality to its level design, so the new move is frequently usable. Dark Souls introduced the mid-roll, which paired with the innovative poise system, massively expanded viable possibilities for builds and equipment setups. In Demon Souls, there is zero reason not to light roll. In Dark Souls, the possibilities are endless, and even fat rolling can be the most optimal strategy in some scenarios. The Humanity mechanic is also more versatile than its Demon Souls equivalent, as it enables players who aren't interested in cooperation to spend their humanities in upgrades to their healing capacity, or perhaps to use them to heal in emergency situations and in invasions. There's the armor upgrade system, which, as explained by Miyazaki, was introduced as a way of ensuring armor remains equally valuable as the game progresses. It was discontinued in later games, as it was an experiment, which they deemed unsatisfactory, due to how difficult it was to fine-tune. Alternate solutions were then employed. This list does not contain refinements to mechanics introduced in Demon Souls, just innovations and substantial expansions. I must again express that Matthew's opening argument genuinely baffles me in how poorly thought it is.
There is one important caveat though. It's not innovative. The goal of Dark Souls wasn't innovation, it was refinement.
He proceeds by saying that the goal of Dark Souls 1 wasn't innovation, but refinement. One must ask, what constitutes innovation in Matthew's mind? No definition or explanation is provided. Bloodborne introduced trick weapons, charge attacks, reworks dodge and backstab mechanics, chalice dungeons, the Mercury mana system, limb breaking, the rally mechanic, guns, the frenzy mechanic, the rune system, blood gems, the insight mechanic. It made multi-phase bosses the norm, massively refining and expanding their designs. Enemies can steal blood echoes upon your death. I could go on. According to the main point Matthew makes in his video, none of these classify as innovations.
This is what really sets Demon Souls apart from the rest of the series. Early in its development, the project was assumed by many in FromSoft to already be a failure. Maybe a demoralizing way to think, but also liberating in a sense. That assumption is the main reason why director Hidetaka Miyazaki was able to take control of the project, and why he and his team were able to implement some, at the time, bizarre features. With Demon's Souls, there was a sense that the developers were just doing whatever the hell they wanted, playing with conventions and trying new features out with little care about how appealing they would be to a mass audience.
There is a quote by Miyazaki that directly contradicts how Matthew presented his argument. Quote, "With Demon's Souls, of course, and while we worked on Dark Souls 1, the expectations around us were still pretty low. All around us, there was always the idea that there is no way something like this will sell." End quote. Miyazaki told the interviewer that Dark Souls was also highly experimental and risky, and wasn't expected to sell, exactly like Demon's Souls. So, the foundation of Matthew's logic, that there is a profound reason for why Demon's Souls was more experimental than even the first Dark Souls, whose goal was not to innovate, but simply to refine, which was that Demon's Souls was a uniquely risky project, is incorrect, according to Miyazaki himself. One must also understand that Demon's Souls didn't sell well in the short term. It was word of mouth that turned it into a cult classic, and only over a prolonged period of time did it do moderately well in terms of sales. Dark Souls was far from a safe investment, or a conventional sequel.
World Tendency is a perfect example of this. Some developers believe that dynamic difficulty tuning is the correct way to build their games, and even games in general. This method of design has been gaining traction since around the 90s, and given its success, it can be found in subtle forms in many mainstream games today. Other people, like myself, prefer when a game is consistently difficult, so there's a more genuine sense of satisfaction when you finally overcome the challenge at hand. Demon's Souls turns its back on both of those ideas and cuts your health in half as soon as you die. As if that isn't enough, repeated deaths will increase enemy stats and eventually spawn additional Black Phantoms to make the stage even tougher. Now you might think this is a poor mechanic. There are some very sound, logical arguments against it. I'm not saying that every game should work this way, but hopefully you can understand that I find this refreshing for the simple fact that it's different from everything else. This, for me at least, was the real appeal of Demon's Souls. Time and again, they threw out the rulebook and just did whatever they felt like. Conventional wisdom says that struggling players should be offered a helping hand, not pushed down a well. Conventional wisdom says that a boss should be killed by the player, not themselves. Conventional wisdom says that secrets should be secret, not pointed out by someone else. Conventional wisdom says that important NPCs and vendors are off limits, not murdered while the player isn't looking. Conventional wisdom says that the final boss should be an epic showdown, a test of the player's skills, not a pathetic, harmless blob.
There are many controversial mechanics in the broader series as well, such as Dark Souls 2's Hollowing penalty. Its reworked invasion system, which allows players to be invaded, even when not in human form, forcing them to burn a human effigy just to block invasions, even if they don't wish to co-op. And most controversial of all, the co-op centered areas of the DLCs. Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons, which lock one of the most unique bosses in the game, which is also a major character, alongside more than a dozen other exclusive enemies and bosses, and even a weapon and other things, behind a series of maze-like, extremely difficult areas, whose progression is far from intuitive, and which aren't part of the main progression of the game, and the Winter Lanterns, which are enemies that turn Bloodborne into a survival horror game whenever they appear. Dark Souls 1, the game he's talked about the most by this point, has an area that, upon entering, locks you into it until you complete it. It has a unique boss, who also happens to be a major character in the story, that is only accessible by shooting at a seemingly important NPC, who is then revealed to be an illusion, and whose death alters the entire area.
It's the boss fights that stick out the most, with 4 of the 5 archdemons clearly being designed to provide a memorable experience above all else. Even False King Allant, the most traditional of the 5, has an incredibly punishing grab which actually de-levels the player character, something the series hasn't seen since. This kind of experimentation doesn't always work. There's not many people out there who'll defend the encounter with the Dragon God, but an occasional failure is to be expected if a game is stepping outside the norm so much. To me, an anticlimactic non-boss like Maiden Astraea has just as much value, if not more, than something more traditional like Flame Lurker. There are other games I can play if I want a Flame Lurker-esque experience, but only one game has Maiden Astraea. Later entries in the series, including the original Dark Souls, have largely done away with those weird boss fights, to the detriment of the overall experience.
In Dark Souls 1, there is a boss that, despite appearing to be a demonic, deformed, evil monster. He's entirely passive. He only becomes hostile against the chosen undead when he robs a corpse at the end of the area. In reality, the ceaseless discharge, he is but a man that was left mentally damaged and whose body turned into a chimeric abomination after his mother tries to replicate the sun in a ritual that engulfed her kingdom in chaos. He is but a cretin, a poor sufferer, whose sole attachment, after all his family had abandoned him, was to the corpse of a sister, which is why he was guarding it. Also in Dark Souls 1 there is a boss that, similarly to Astrea, does not wish to harm us. Quite the contrary. Priscilla begs us to leave her home. Unlike with Astrea, the player is not mandated to kill her, and can simply exit the area. Dark Souls 2 has similarly innovative, unconventional bosses, such as Vendrick, who's entirely passive unless provoked. And as we meet this fallen, legendary king, who isn't just a main character of the game, but a parallel to the player character, we hear a somber subversion of the theme of Majula playing in the background. Vendrick is also virtually immortal, until you hold enough giant souls. Upon attacking him, he doesn't even flinch. His health bar doesn't even appear. At first the player is completely puzzled. It's one of the most memorable moments in the entire series to those that weren't spoiled. There's also the Burnt Ivory King, which we can either face alone, or accompanied by his own knights, which we can back on by finding them throughout the DLC.
To understand why this is a bad thing, we have to confront a hard truth that few people seem to want to face about the Souls games, including FromSoft themselves, but here it is. The combat is nothing remarkable. Before you get your codpiece in a twist, keep in mind that doesn't equate to mediocre gameplay. As a whole, it's hugely elevated by generally great level design, player freedom, loadout options, and some unique supplemental mechanics like World Tendency, Covenants, and Insight. The stamina system puts other action RPGs to shame, the animations are great, and the controls are tight, but in terms of actual complexity, there's not much going on. There's not much depth, and that wouldn't be a problem, except that the series has increasingly leaned on its action elements more and more as time has gone by.
And then he begins to espouse one of the most annoying arguments he'll keep bringing up throughout the video, with the smuggest possible delivery. That, according to him, there is nothing remarkable about the combat mechanics of Dark Souls. A fact even the developers don't want to face, only Matthew is brave enough to do it. And there are plenty of other games we can play, if we want a better, more complex version of what Dark Souls does. He really is the final boss of mid-witted, pretentious video essayists. As a reminder, his video was posted in 2017, before the dreaded trend of non-From Software, Souls-like games had fully emerged. Matthew, of course, never even tries to define what complexity entails in this case. Could he be referring to hack-and-slash games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, which have absolutely nothing to do with Dark Souls? He is a Zelda fan, but I'm sure he couldn't have been thinking about those, as they are offensively simplistic and easy for the most part. And Ninja Gaiden and Monster Hunter are way too different to be apt comparisons. He never attempts to explain it, and does not provide even a single example to compare Dark Souls to. That's because there are none. The combat of Dark Souls is wholly unique, and the lack of intricate combos, and supplementary mechanics like that, work in its favor, never against it. This holds true even for later installments of the extended series, such as Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. One cannot quickly and simply describe what makes the combat of Dark Souls so gratifying and fun and special. It's a combination of factors that make it great. Its backbone is the innovative and unique stamina mechanic, whose only parallel is that of Monster Hunter, but even then, Monster Hunter's stamina system is much more rudimentary and primarily applies to running and dodging. You actually regenerate stamina as you attack. The attack animations of Souls games are weighty, and work well with the stamina and the input queue systems, making you feel like each button press matters. And they do. The healing animation requires the player to commit, unlike in other games, like Zelda Breath of the Wild, Dragon's Dogma, or Skyrim, that allow you to simply pause the combat to heal as much as you want through a menu, shattering all tension and trivializing the experience, as long as you've got food or potions. The parry mechanic is incredibly satisfying to master. Blocking, too, works unlike in many other games, due to the stamina system. Yes, the dodges, which are heavy on iframes, are integral to the experience, and did become more useful as the games got faster, but they have never supplanted the concept that really elevates the combat to another level, which is spacing and positioning. Mastering spacing and positioning He's what separates the average Souls player from the great Souls player. In the Souls games, the vast majority of attacks are either telegraphed or predictable, and hitboxes are, as a rule, very accurate to the animations. The moment-to-moment gameplay of many veteran players only sparsely includes rolling, at least for Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 and 2. The backstabbing mechanic, though somewhat unrefined in the first two entries, is also immensely rewarding to master, and that's not counting the vast array of other things, some of which Matthew did mention, that work alongside the combats, such as the variety in builds and loadouts, the level design, the absurd enemy variety, and so on. It's difficult to argue against a point that has never been properly made. I can also say unsubstantiated, hyperbolic, biased things about other franchises, like Counter-Strike's gunplay sucks, or Resident Evil 4's combat is clunky. Such claims have zero argumentative value. And as we'll see, Matthew spends the entire video repeating similar meaningless claims again and again, while simultaneously proving he misunderstands even the very basics of the combat system he's purportedly critiquing.
Bloodborne is the clearest example of this so far. The player character's starting stamina is generous, and it's easy to level up every useful stat for your build with no meaningful trade-offs whatsoever. At this point, stats mainly exist so struggling players can grind out an advantage and carry on, the kind of self-controlled dynamic difficulty the series excels at. To put it simply, Bloodborne is more action, less RPG.
Matthew claims that in Bloodborne, stats mainly exist so struggling players can farm for levels and become overpowered to more easily handle the game. Is this really an argument? Even though Bloodborne leans towards the action element, it is still an RPG. The player can create a variety of unique builds through the leveling system, paired with the blood gems and the runes of Karil, and also navigates the non-linear world of Bloodborne in different ways each playthrough. Going through the Kinghurst Castle at level 30 on a blood-tinged build to defeat Logarius early on so you can obtain the Shikage is a vastly different experience than going through it at level 70. But for a more average example, going through Old Yharnam as your second area, and then in a different playthrough, going through it as your fourth, is also rather different, all depending on which stats you level as well. Can this part of the experience be simplified as higher levels means easier gameplay? Would that be a fair simplification, not to mention the feeling of progression that derives from enhancing a character? But the major rebuke to Matthew's claim is the question: how is that any different from what you can do in Demon Souls? How is Bloodborne's leveling system substantially different in its implementation to that of Demon Souls at all? Matthew, once again, does not even attempt to provide a justification for his nonsensical, bad faith claim. Are the blood gems similarly pointless? Are the runes of Karil and even weapon upgrades also pointless? Are skill trees in Neo pointless too? Are the armor sets and weapons of classic Monster Hunter pointless? What even constitutes a meaningful action RPG mechanic? He never elaborates upon that, or how Demon Souls implements them better than the other games of the Souls series, because he can't.
Unfortunately, even with the addition of trick weapons, there's still a case to be made that overall the combat doesn't even have depth exceeding basic action games. If you're a staunch defender of the series, this is where you might be tempted to rattle off all the different attack animations your favourite weapon has. After all, there's two-handed attacks, jumping attacks, running attacks, charged attacks, transformation attacks, and probably more. It's true that there are differences in range and damage, but the effect on the enemy is usually identical. They lose some health, possibly suffer some hit stun, which either lasts long enough to get another attack in, or it doesn't, in which case you go back on the defensive until your next opening. Positioning is important, but that's about the extent of it.
Once again, Matthew smugly and pretentiously claims something without backing it up. He says the depth of Bloodborne's combat system doesn't even exceed that of basic action games. How in the world did he reach that conclusion? He never explains it. He never says what constitutes a basic action game, or depth, or anything else. To prove how insulting this style of pseudo-argumentation is, I'll do one of my own. Metal Gear Rising has a very basic combat system. Yes, you can parry and dodge attacks, and even slash your opponents with a variety of cutting attacks. It's true that there are many ways in which you can interact with your opponents, but their reactions are usually identical. They lose some health, possibly suffer some hit stun, which allows you to combo them. Or you can target a weak point to deliver a critical hit, and that's about it. But its deluded fans do not want to admit this harsh truth, Nuke. Its combat is not special at all. It's as simple as that of a basic action game. See how stupid I sound? I almost rage-baited myself. Here's Matthew saying that Dark Souls and other modern From Software games would benefit from, say, hair-juggling combo mechanics as the one featured in Devil May Cry, or from a combo meter that builds up a special attack. He'd never be so bold as to say anything of substance. With this argument, he proves he doesn't understand the basics of Bloodborne's combat, and dismisses the changes it brought alongside its faster-paced gameplay. Guns are not just shields that cannot block, they are more akin to ranged weapons that can parry from a distance. In Dark Souls, parrying is only possible and glued to the front of a target. This means that in Bloodborne, you can dodge backwards from an attack and parry its follow-up, for instance, or that you can parry from the sides, and even from the back of an enemy, things that occur sometimes. There are some bosses that can only be consistently parried by taking advantage of the range of your guns. With a Dark Souls style shield, they would be virtually impossible to parry, if not through extreme prediction. Also, the guns deal damage, and can be upgraded, and even buffed with Bone Marrow Ash. Even without a specific build, they can be very useful in dishing out damage to specific enemy weak points, given also their precision. And this leads me to mentioning one of the best innovations by Bloodborne, the limb system. Many bosses and enemies have not just weak points, but body parts that are breakable. Breaking them results in a stagger, sometimes in a riposte, and when broken, the body part takes extra damage. Most bosses can heal themselves to restore the condition of body parts, but their healing animations are punishable, just like the players. This mechanic significantly changes the combat whenever it is a factor. Experienced players can effectively neutralize bosses through a methodic and focused attack chain. Matthew of course never brings it up. Perhaps he didn't even know it was a thing, given he's far from an attentive player, and honestly worse than DSP gaming mechanically. This is not an exaggeration. He tried using poison arrows and poison weapons against one of the rat bosses of Dark Souls 2, and complains that the minions took 2 hits to kill, and he struggles to defeat the prowling magus and congregation. Bloodborne's enemies and bosses also have vastly more complex, varied movesets that demand more from the player, both positioning-wise and timing-wise. I know some of you will say, but that isn't what depth is just new mechanics. To which I simply reply, Matthew never properly defined what depth is. By my definition, which is definitely more reasonable than his, a game whose enemies and bosses are twice as dense as those of another game has deeper and more sophisticated combat gameplay. This increase in enemy and boss moveset variety was carried on to Dark Souls 3 and subsequent games. It's also worth noting that there are many parryable bosses in Bloodborne, while in Demon Souls there are none, and in Dark Souls 1 there was a single one. Matthew similarly disregards the thrice as complex player movesets from Bloodborne, because he fails to understand the importance of spacing, which is the most important factor of Soulsborne combat, alongside dodge timing. Having both a piercing attack, and a horizontal slash while walking, or running, or dodging, or backstepping is significant if you know how useful proper spacing is, and most weapons having a special ability, or wildly different movesets that can be changed in one fluid move, as in the transform attacks, is a big deal. Having vertical attacks is particularly useful, as they can be used to target weak points that would be out of reach otherwise. The combination of all aforementioned factors, and more, make the combat of From Software's games truly unique, incredibly fun and satisfying. One could argue it to not be as mechanically complex and demanding as the combat of games like Nioh, Monster Hunter, and Ninja Gaiden, but firstly, that's not the point Matthew was making. Secondly, those games lack mechanics, or other things that are key to Souls games, which work in tandem with their combat systems to elevate the complete experience. And thirdly, even if one concedes, it is simpler than the combat of the most mechanically complex games one can think of, that also doesn't make it unremarkable in any way.
If anything, Bloodborne actually has less depth than any other game in the series because shields are disincentivized and unable to parry, making the two things mutually exclusive when players used to be able to do both without having to swap between them.
It's also funny how Matthew addresses the shields, as though they are a relevant option in Bloodborne, claiming that it's cumbersome to switch between your gun and your shields to parry, as though that is a bad thing, when one of the shields is little more than a joke, and I mean it literally, and the other is an asterisk. Even still, the developers did account for players who might want to use a shield alongside a parry tool. That is a right-handed weapon with the unique ability to parry like a gun, the Reiter Palach. Seriously, I haven't seen anyone misunderstand the subject more than Matthew does, consistently.
The magic implementation is also quite bare bones, and it even lacks a kick option, although that would be irrelevant anyway since so few enemies have a defensive stance.
The only way one can argue magic to be simpler in Bloodborne, mechanically speaking, is because of the lack of an attunement system, though the mana system of Bloodborne, the Mercury Bullet currency, which allows you to trade health for mana points, dynamically, through an animation, also requiring commitment, mid-action, is certainly more complex, not less so. The spells themselves, or rather, the hunter tools, aren't any less interesting individually than the spells of the other Souls games. They are, however, not as varied or versatile as a collective. But again, Matthew is missing the point. Bloodborne focuses on faster-paced action. Magic obviously detracts from that to some degree, which is why the developers are cautious when designing the hunter tools.
Apart from destroying the grounded aesthetic these games are or were known for, the weapon arts of Dark Souls 3 are kind of a step in the right direction, but the synergy between all these things is practically non-existent. For example, there's few spells that allow you to set up an enemy for an interesting melee attack and vice versa.
In which way do weapon arts, which are, for the most part, glorified martial arts, destroy the grounded aesthetic which these games are known for? If he's referring to the more magical weapon arts, Dark Souls 1 had special moves as well. This is an extreme level of nitpicking. And right after saying the weapon arts are a step in the right direction, he claims they don't synergize with all of these things, and he justifies this claim by saying there's few spells that allow you to set up an enemy for a melee attack and vice versa. What is this statement even supposed to mean?
In terms of defensive options, the series is a lot better, with the ability to block, parry or dodge most regular attacks. These go a long way during regular combat encounters, but unfortunately against bosses, parrying is often completely impossible and blocking is often ill-advised, which leaves you with rolling as your one and only defensive action. So prepare to roll, again and again, and again and again and again.
Then, Matthew says rolling is the only defensive action against bosses for the most part, again proving he does not understand the Souls series very well. He gets very smug once again, as he reduces the combat to rolling and attacking, which is an argument that only works if the audience is made up of newcomers to the series. Firstly, how is blocking ill-advised against bosses? He never proves such a thing. It certainly isn't against most bosses in Dark Souls 1. It can be very useful in Dark Souls 2 as well, and though it's not as strong in 3, it's far from being an unviable option. And while blocking was nerfed a little bit, Dark Souls 3 refines the movement system so that you can run in all directions while locked on, adding a new layer to the combat. And Dark Souls 3 features plenty of parryable bosses, almost half of them, with shields being very useful against some of them, countering the original point Matthew was making. It must be said, though, that block-focused builds and setups are severely underrated in Dark Souls 3. Many bosses can be utterly trivialized with larger shields, or with shield buffing spells.
When you're not rolling, you'll generally be getting 1 to 2 hits in with whatever weapon you choose, hits that usually provoke no response from the boss whatsoever, making every weapon basically the same thing apart from whatever damage types and numbers it has.
Matthew hilariously argues that since enemies, well, lose HP when getting hit, and bosses don't immediately react with a stagger, all weapons are basically the same, besides the RPG mechanics like damage types, numbers and so on. Brilliant insight on his part. I had never considered that factors such as range, hitboxes, attack speed, poise, damage values, hyper armor, and unique attacks didn't matter at all. Yet again Matthew argues in a fallacious way, by reducing things until they stop making sense. Through this logic, every gun of every FPS game ever is the same, every fighting game character is the same. But also, it's funny how the game he criticizes the most in his video is Bloodborne. Bloodborne specifically features some of the most dynamic boss reactions to player inputs of any game. In this clip, you can see Amelia reacts to body parts being damaged, with 3 different animations for individual limbs, and a stagger.
That's not to say that bosses like this can't be good. They can be. At their worst, they're camera-eating monstrosities with infinite stamina that blatantly read your inputs, cancel their recovery animations and have nonsensical tracking, but at their best, they're fair, challenging and have great presentation.
The next thing he says about the bosses can't be reasonably interpreted as anything other than him venting his frustrations and passing it as a critique. He just throws a bunch of insults at combat-oriented From Software bosses, without justifying any of them, while showing footage of Amelia, which is a well-designed boss that's far from being frustrating to fight against because of any such issues. I must repeat the comparison. He sounds more like DSP Gaming ranting about the Souls games, than a respectable critic sharing a thoughtful opinion. Which bosses would he consider to have quote-unquote infinite stamina? He doesn't provide a single example. If he is referring to bosses like Sullivan, Champion Gundyr, or Orphan of course, they each have fair movesets and a particular mechanical weakness which the player can exploit, such as parrying or backstabbing. They were designed as overly aggressive, doubtlessly with that specific weakness in mind, as a primary solution. Those that are exceptionally aggressive, but do not have a glaring weakness, such as Ludwig and Gale, have movesets that are immensely enjoyable to deal with and master, and are considered among the best bosses ever designed by From Software. Or rather, among the best the medium has to offer. By the way, Amelia does have a soft gimmick, which is her self-healing capability. She can heal not just broken limbs, but her health points. The player can counter it either by using Numbing Mist, by out-DPSing her heal, or by triggering a limb break during her animation, which can be set up in advance. As for input reading, most Souls bosses read and punish only the healing input, and that's really easy to circumvent. The player should not try to heal in front of the boss, but after an opening. How is that a bad thing? Was the boss supposed to stay still and not react, like any creature with a brain would, intuitively? Is this really a fault of the AI, of the boss design, that it punishes careless healing, and rewards methodic, intentional play?
False King Allant is a great boss, so are Artorias, Ludwig and Sister Fried among many others FromSoft have put together over the years, but they're also undeniably samey. You go in, you learn the moveset, maybe you die a few times along the way until you know the boss's moves like the back of your hand, then you dodge past them, punish at the right times and win the battle. It's perfectly serviceable gameplay, but doing it 20 times in one game is just excessive. This has been the go-to boss design philosophy for FromSoft ever since Artorias of the Abyss, and fights have only gotten more shonen anime over time. To be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with simple combat mechanics. I'm not saying you should be able to juggle hollows or anything, but if the game is going to be so relentlessly focused on action, then I have fewer reasons not to just play a better action game instead. What I can't get elsewhere are the memorable experiences that Demon's Souls presented by taking risks. The Archdemons are the clearest example of that, but even its more traditional boss fights serve a greater purpose. Demon's Souls' greatest strength is how it pulls you into its bleak, dangerous world so that you think about situations the way you would if you were actually there. This is something that the Souls games continue to do kind of well, but Demon's Souls still does it the best of them all because, excluding the innovative online features, almost everything else works in service of that larger goal. Phalanx, Leechmonger, Tower Knight, Fool's Idol, Old Hero, Maneaters and Armor Spider all have quirks to their design or their arena that the player can exploit if they figure out. You don't outright win by doing so, but you gain a big advantage if you're willing to use your brain. It's a deceptively simple concept. Thinking about how to survive a boss by using clever tactics is exactly what a real adventurer would do. In a sense, the battle happens just as much outside the fog door as inside. Because of that, the mindset of the character and the player align in such a way that it pulls the player further into the experience. On the other hand, dodging telegraphed attacks which come out in predefined combos is just exploiting your knowledge that the AI is acting within the constraints of a computer game. This has the opposite effect. It widens the gap between the character and the player.
Matthew lays down one of the most important points of his video, that bosses of Demon's Souls had for the most part puzzle-like gimmicks, while those of later titles feature no such creative and unique mechanics and are repetitively designed. This argument is not simply incorrect, it proves, for the millionth time, that Matthew does not know what he's talking about. And the more he tries and fails to expand upon this point, the more he frankly embarrasses himself as a video game critic. He insanely uses as an example of a semi-combat-focused boss, Frida from Dark Souls 3. Frida is not just masterfully executed as an action experience, she is also one of the most mechanically unique bosses of the Souls series. Matthew simply dismisses her entire fight as consisting of a generic moveset which you memorize and reacts to, when, in the first phase of her fight, which he's showing on screen as he's saying this nonsense, she has a gimmick in which she turns invisible and flees from the player, forcing him to look for her by paying attention to sound cues and subtle visual effects. You can either fail at spotting her and get punished, miss an attack opening, punish her with a couple hits, or even backstab her, if you are agile enough. In Frida's second phase, Ariandel joins the fight, flipping it upside down. He acts more like a stage hazard than an actual enemy. His attacks are slow, but their range is enormous. Meanwhile, Frida acts stealthily, targeting the player with area-denying frost AoEs that detonate after a few seconds, healing herself and Ariandel while invisible, compelling the player to search for her like in the first phase. But this time, while a giant beast man screams and runs around in a frenzy, and she sometimes jumps into action unexpectedly. Ariandel is an easy target, but Frida will try her best to stop you from hitting him too often. However, if you do manage to remain aggressive, you're able to break his poise, stagger, and riposte him. And in the third phase of the fight, Frida revives with an enhanced moveset, but she can still turn invisible and catch you off guard. Matthew dismissed all of this and classified Frida as a mere combat-oriented, gimmickless boss. Why? Because he simply cannot comprehend that a boss can have a gimmick while not being a one-trick pony. That a boss can have unique mechanics that are smoothly integrated into its moveset. Indeed, the bosses of Demon's Souls often lacked a proper moveset, and were entirely designed around a singular puzzle mechanic. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but each of its successors tries to evolve this formula in many different ways. There are, as in Demon's Souls, bosses that lack a puzzle mechanic. There are bosses that are mostly puzzle-oriented, but most bosses stand somewhere in between. Is this a bad thing? Are the bosses of From Software only special and remarkable when they don't have a flexible moveset? Absolutely not. Matthew only thinks this because he is seemingly incapable of realizing that From Software games are not meant to be glorified Zelda clones. Bosses that have overbearing gimmicks can be interesting, fun, and engaging, but they more often than not completely negate not just the action, but also the RPG component of the Souls games. No matter your character, bosses like the Dragon God, or the Ancient Wyvern, will always be fought the exact same way with little to no room for build or skill expression. And may I remind you that the only reason Matthew discredits the more combat-focused bosses as repetitive is because he doesn't think the Souls games, even Bloodborne, are engaging as action games, a terrible opinion which he never substantiates, and so cannot judge them properly on their own merits. I initially wrote a detailed analysis of the roster of each Soulsborne title, as a refutation of Matthew's claim, but honestly, it would be long-winded and mostly pointless to include that, when his argument is so utterly poor, misinformed, and unsubstantiated to begin with. I will instead refute it on its principle. As showcased before, bosses which Matthew considered gimmickless and repetitively designed around combat do have unique and innovative gimmicks which happen to be fluidly integrated into their movesets. This fact alone discredits his arguments. For instance, he considers the old hero to be uniquely designed, but not Frida, even though the unique mechanic of the former is actually easier to ignore than that of the latter. You could fight the old hero and not even realize he was blind, but you can't fight Frida without having to deal with her invisibility, and so on. Matthew never delineates what constitutes a unique mechanic or design. Should it be mandatory to defeat the boss? Evidently not, given the example which I just provided. He also uses the Man-Eaters and the Leechmonger as examples of bosses with quirks the player can explore. By this parameter, there are, proportionally, less gimmick or unique bosses in Demon's Souls than in some of its successors. Dark Souls 1, going by his standards, has only Quelaag. If her area-denying lava is not considered a unique mechanic, the Demon Fire Sage and the Stray Demon, even though their movesets encourage spacing and positioning instead of conventional dodging. The Sanctuary Guardian, and maybe Artorias and Calamite, 6 or 7 bosses out of 26. Demon's Souls would have 4 out of 17. Vanguard, the Penetrator, and as mentioned by Matthew himself, False King Allant, and the Flame Lurker.
What I can't get elsewhere are the memorable experiences that Demon's Souls presented by taking risks.
He points out how Demon's Souls went out of its way to be risky. He is locking the player away in a difficult secret area until he can reach its end, not a risk which the developers took. The very DLC of Dark Souls 1 is essentially a secret. The player must kill a specific enemy in a hidden location to unlock a new NPC, and then kill another very specific enemy to get a key item. Then he must return to the location where he first fought that first specific enemy to get access to a portal that wasn't there before. And in the DLC itself, there is a boss that more or less instantly kills the player, giving no chance at a counterattack. The only way to properly fight it is to find a hidden key, which unlocks an NPC that can shoot the wing of the dragon so it can't fly properly anymore, enabling you to fight it. Is that not a risk? Is the Covenant system not a risk? Are the many innovations brought with each installment not risky? In fact, was the faster pace of Bloodborne, and did the emphasis on shields and defensive play not a risk too? This argument can only be made after the success of these titles and DLCs was already achieved. It's also highly hypocritical of him to argue that, when he complained about every risk Dark Souls 2 took as a sequel, even saying the developers did not know what they were doing, and that they should never have gotten their jobs.
It seems to me like they didn't understand the significance of healing in Dark Souls, in which case they should never have been placed in charge of this game. The schizophrenic design of Dark Souls 2 seems to just change, fix and break things at random.
In his critique of Dark Souls 2, he also complained about the highly experimental mechanic of the Rat Covenant, claiming it was unfair and frustrating.
This isn't a PvP exchange, it's a meat grinder designed for the amusement of the rat. Some people defend this by saying the victim loses nothing in the engagement even if they die, but this is a weak excuse. Being pulled out of a level into a load screen only to be slaughtered by impossible odds, taunted by an enemy player and then kicked back into a load screen is a waste of time at best.
The mechanic in question is meant to deter the player from progressing through the area by turning him into both the hunter and the prey in a game of cat and mouse, in which the odds are stacked against him. There is no single game other than Dark Souls 2 with a mechanic like that. So, are creative, risky, potentially controversial mechanics a good or a bad thing, Matthew? Apparently, it's a bad thing if the games they are featured in are not Demon Souls.
To be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with simple combat mechanics. I'm not saying you should be able to juggle hollows or anything, but if the game is going to be so relentlessly focused on action, then I have fewer reasons not to just play a better action game instead.
Matthew does joke that he doesn't necessarily want to juggle hollows, yet he follows upon that by saying that Dark Souls and so on are so relentlessly focused on action, and because of that, he could simply play a better action game instead. He may not wish for juggle mechanics, but what else does he think the Souls games need to justify their action? He never says anything, and also never provides an example of a better combat experience. Regardless, he's missing the point of these games. His point is that using clever tactics to overcome a boss is more memorable. I agree, which is why I love the design philosophy of From Software, and can fully appreciate what they did with each title, which is why I find it very satisfying to have mastered Frida's invisibility mechanic, so that I can punish her with a backstab and 2 follow-up attacks consistently. And even why I find fighting a boss like Ebrietas by carefully exploiting her weak point, with specific attacks that can hit it while remaining ever careful of her dash attack, so gratifying. Figuring out the moveset of a boss is a puzzle in and of itself, and does require clever thinking. You can watch any challenge run of any of these titles, for instance, and you'll see plenty of mind-boggling strategies being employed in real time. These games do have plenty of tactical and mechanical depth. They are just not as outwardly complex as hack and slash style action games, with numerous combos, skill trees, and so on.
On the other hand, dodging telegraphed attacks which come out in predefined combos is just exploiting your knowledge that the AI is acting within the constraints of a computer game.
Matthew's reduction of it all as exploiting the telegraphed movements of an AI in a computer game is insulting to anyone of even average intelligence. I can also make any video game ever seem stupid if I simplify it in such a way, because what's actually stupid is the simplification. Many of the bosses, which I'm certain Matthew would classify as bland in this sense, are designed creatively and can be beaten through wit in varied ways. For instance, novice players will likely try to roll the attacks of the Taurus demon and punish it with light attacks. And while reliable, this strategy is not the smoothest, as the bridge restrains lateral movement. However, it's also possible to lure the boss to a tower to fight it at a battle arena, something intelligent players would attempt to do. The most attentive among this subset of players would also think to plunge attack the boss, recalling how they defeated the Asylum Demon. And players who have mastered the combat mechanics will think it's easier to simply outspace the attacks of the boss, instead of trying to dodge them, a tactic that nullifies the narrowness of the bridge. Casters will have an even easier time. While the moveset of the Taurus Demon is rather simple, the developers ensures that fighting it would be engaging, and rewarding to all types of players.
Most elements of Demon's Souls can be viewed through this same lens. The environments are filled with difficult encounters, traps and ambushes, not just for their own sake, but to encourage a slow, methodical approach to exploration. This contrasts with the blasé way most protagonists throw themselves into dangerous situations. In reality, people tend to act more cautiously when they have a chance of being brutally murdered, so those punishing mechanics encourage you to think and behave that way.
Traps and area gimmicks weren't abandoned or forgotten after Demon's Souls. Each game has plenty of areas with unique layouts and mechanics. If you want to talk about punishing traps, Bloodborne has by far the most dangerous of the franchise in its chalice dungeons. Arrow traps that can one-shot you, hidden guillotines, oil fields, at which enemies bombard you with Molotov cocktails, etc. Ironically enough, variations of the exact trap Matthew showcases in Demon's Souls are present in Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, and Bloodborne. Literally every successor to Demon's Souls up until he made the video. Returning to Bloodborne, there are also many traps outside of the Chalice dungeons, especially in the Forbidden Woods, and in the Research Hall. Dark Souls 1 has many area gimmicks. New Londo is covered in water, and is populated with ghosts that can ambush you through walls and objects. The Tomb of the Giants is perpetually dark. The Duke's Archives is structured like a puzzle with its movable stairways. Blightstown is a vertical hell. Its enemies apply tactics of guerrilla warfare against you, and its lower section is a swamp. Following it is Lost Izalith, whose floor is lava. The depths are like a maze, and riddled with enemy ambushes. You can get cursed, and lose half your health until a purging stone is consumed. Since Fortress is filled with traps, and tricky obstacles of various kinds, I could go on. Bloodborne has an area in which the player is constantly targeted by a minigun, and there are exploding barrels all over the place, that when detonated, can kill in one hit. The Forbidden Woods is riddled with traps and ambushes, as the area is, like Blightstown, designed after guerrilla tactics. Yahar'gul has giant Lovecraftian monsters that shoot laser beams at you, and bell-bearing maidens that can endlessly summon waves of spectral enemies. The Nightmare of Mensis has an alien brain you must hide from, or else you get frenzied. Demon's Souls may be one of the games in the series denser with unique mechanics proportionally speaking, but it's also the shortest one, and its spiritual sequels are far from uncreative as implied by Matthew.
Perpetually autosaving over a single save file reinforces this as well. Even a trivial choice can feel like it has serious consequences because it's irreversible, just like real life. Of course, these elements work better the more unknowns you go up against. In other words, the element of surprise is pretty important. Venturing into Demon's Souls felt like venturing into the unknown, not because it was narratively unpredictable, but because it was mechanically unpredictable. Even once you got used to the Souls series features, which were brand new at the time, it still made sure to throw curveballs at you on a regular basis. Lack of careful observation was punished. NPCs weren't always what they appeared to be. Bosses often had unique mechanics, and even the environments could be polar opposites of each other. Try one archstone and you'll end up in the claustrophobic halls of Latria. Try the other and you're headed towards a sprawling poison swamp. Incidentally, while you're spending so much time scanning the scenery for suspicious areas, you can't help but realise that the environments are actually built a lot like real places, much more so than any other game in this series. Shortcuts aren't just inexplicably one-sided gates or needlessly complex elevators, they're blockades to keep intruders out or mechanisms for transporting materials. This is half the point of shortcuts in the first place. They're a way of presenting checkpoints without making the world seem like it was built just for your convenience. After picking up on those environmental details, you might go on to notice that the enemy design and item placements have also been carefully considered to suit the area in question. What might not even occur to you is how sparse the cutscenes are, keeping interruptions to a minimum, or that the sound design could be described as minimalist as well. Most of what you hear as you wander through the stages is completely diegetic. Even death and resurrection are contextualized by the Nexus, weakening the barrier between the player and the game. By this point, the biggest thing standing between you and Boletaria are the loading screens. The word I've been avoiding is immersion, but hopefully now that I've explained it, you can see that's what it is. Demon's Souls' greatest strength is its immersive quality. That alone would be enough to make it a pretty good game, but what puts it over the top is the way it capitalizes on that immersion by throwing the player into a variety of situations which they can now experience as a first-hand participant. Patch's trickery, the imposing mind flayers, Yurt's betrayal, among many others. All these things hit harder because the game does so much work establishing itself beforehand.
His next point is really funny, considering all of the things he said are also applicable to the other Souls games. The Dark Souls series takes place at Imperfect's dreamlike worlds, which is why it features more space-time distortions than Demon's Souls. Something that, while obvious, neither Matthew nor the vast majority of the fans of the series understood. But that's about it.
The rest of the series has thoughtlessly replicated many ideas from Demon's Souls, which often defeats the purpose and occasionally completely misses the point. The first time you have to make your way through a poison swamp, it's a new and interesting challenge. It gets your guard up, you have to think about your situation and make sure you have suitable equipment on hand. After 5 games in a row, it's become a predictable, tiresome routine. Even though it's the exact same thing mechanically, it now pulls you out of the game rather than in.
Matthew once again engages with the topic in the smuggest, most condescending way possible, by claiming the other games merely replicate, thoughtlessly, Demon's Souls' ideas, often defeating the purpose and completely missing the point. The irony of this statement is ridiculous. Complaining that certain level archetypes like poison swamps reappear is like complaining that every Mario game has water levels, or that every Monster Hunter game has an ice or desert area. Each poison level in the Souls games has unique things that distinguish them from the others. Be it their layout, the way the mechanic is executed, the story of the area, the enemies, etc.
As bad as that is, there's few things worse than when the designers botch traps and ambushes. One of the most disappointing examples is the giant archer in the Undead Settlement. You can see this situation coming a mile away, so when you finally arrive at the field of giant arrows, it's obvious you need to think about your approach first. For a brief moment, this mimics the best of Demon's Souls. You're there, as an adventurer, trying to decide how to overcome a difficult situation. You even have as much time to think about it as you like. The most reasonable line of thought is that the arrow will have a certain amount of travel time, so if you change direction after you hear the shot, you'll be safe. Wrong. The arrow magically curves in mid-air because this is no longer a series where you outsmart your opponents, it's a series where you press the roll button at the right time.
His reasoning for claiming the segment with the archer in Dark Souls 3 is bad is that it requires the player to time dodges in relation to the arrows. How is that worse, objectively, than asking the player to easily move away from them? Is it because it requires more efforts? Either way, this session was there primarily to introduce this mechanic. The Smoldering Lake, which is where it is employed at large, has giant trees which you can use as cover, and you can even clear it entirely, including its mini-boss, the Sandworm, by baiting the shots against the enemies. So, by using wit, you can exploit this level gimmick to your advantage. The game had already shown that the arrows can damage enemies.
To be fair to the later games, it's important to point out that flashes of Demon's Souls style brilliance do show through from time to time, and it's telling that they're often some of the most memorable moments in their respective games. Intentionally turning the Sith fight into an anticlimax is far more impactful than just letting it play out normally. This is especially funny to look back on now that the series seems obsessed with multi-phase bosses that get stronger after you smack them around a bit. The reality is, when you slash a big wolf creature enough times, it has trouble standing up. Rather than let you feel like a big man all the time, Dark Souls tried to remind you of the grim reality, and it worked.
Matthew's next argument is implied to be that it's nonsensical for bosses to have multiple phases, because when you hit them more, they logically shouldn't get stronger. And he portrays multi-phase boss fights as a negative thing, with passive-aggressive scorn on his voice. One of the major points he brought up is that the Souls games are simpler and duller than even basic action games. Yet he complains that now bosses are more complex, showcasing once again his extreme bias and his nonsensical argumentation. How is it a bad thing that bosses have twice, thrice, or quadruple the number of moves and sometimes mechanics as their Demon's Souls counterparts? Each boss that does have multiple phases has them for an in-universe reason. Ludwig doesn't necessarily get stronger. After fighting against a skilled hunter as a mindless beast, he regains a vestige of humanity in a tragic twist and unsheathes his sword. After Ornstein is defeated, Smough absorbs his soul to inherit his power, or vice versa. After he defeats the King of the Storm, the Nameless King too absorbs its soul and fights one-on-one.
I assume that most people enjoy Sif anyway because you get a pretty normal fight at the start, so how about I give you a genuinely unpopular opinion? My favourite boss in Bloodborne isn't Garmin or Ludwig or the Orphan, it's this mad bastard. Mikolash feels like a boss for people who enjoy Demon Souls because he does something a boss isn't supposed to. He runs away. Trying to catch him while he flees and rambles like a nutcase is unlike anything else in the entire series. This is made all the better by the way Bloodborne firmly establishes itself as a grim game. The Nightmare of Mensis is an imposing place, but at the same time there's something vaguely comedic about Mikolash's cowardly behaviour. It's not done just for the sake of it though. If anything, it would be disappointing if such a Lovecraftian game didn't have a fight against a mad scholar. It comes together well, and again, it's something I can't quite get elsewhere, which isn't to say that it's good just because it's different, but that certainly helps. In a 2009 interview about Demon Souls, Miyazaki himself said, "When designing the bosses, I made sure that they would be varied and exciting. I prepared different gameplay and strategies for each one so that players didn't get tired of the same fight every time. We wanted to surprise players and encourage them to figure out different tactics, to think on their feet." It's been the better part of a decade since that interview, so it's fully possible that Miyazaki has changed his mind since then, but it's still a quote that resonates with me at least.
That quote from Miyazaki is still applicable to even the most recent titles. Again, just because the combat mechanics have been polished, expanded upon, and the pacing has increased in speed, it doesn't mean bosses don't feature weaknesses that can be exploited, and, or unique gimmicks and mechanics, as previously established. The only game which you can argue to be substantially more lackluster in these regards is Elden Ring, but it had not been released when Matthew made his essay, and even it has plenty of unique and gimmicky bosses, and it compensates in other ways, such as by having a tremendous amount of weapons, hashes of war, spells, and so on which the player can experiment with, a deeper combat system, the least linear progression to date, and also the most build variety, etc. As previously discussed, gimmicky bosses often force the player to approach them in the same way, regardless of build, playstyle and loadout, meaning a core tenet of Souls design, the one which Elden Ring emphasizes the most, would be largely ignored by such bosses. Disliking its approach is a matter of preference.
If the Dancer of the Boreal Valley had been in Demon Souls, I probably would have loved it. It has an intriguing visual design and the unconventional attack animations present a good challenge. The reason I don't enjoy it is because it's in a game filled with bosses just like it. FromSoft have long since figured out that one way they can punish players who carelessly roll around all the time is to hold the anticipation phase of attack animations for about half a second longer than you'd expect. They've completely abused this trick to the point where most bosses seem to have at least a few of those attacks, and even many basic enemies do as well. This could be a whole topic by itself, but rather than dwell on it, let's just focus on the fact that by the time you reach the Dancer, you've already had to adapt to a huge number of unconventional timings designed solely to catch you out. The thought of learning even more weird attack animations so I can roll and stab my way to victory yet again just isn't all that appealing anymore. I could point to many of the bosses in Dark Souls 3 and say that they're pretty good, but only in isolation. A great game is more than the sum of its parts. A little restraint would go a long way, as has been proven in a few other instances. Most of us can probably agree that the reveal of Irithyll in Dark Souls 3 is one of its better moments. You emerge from the catacombs and see a beautiful, snow-covered landscape topped by a crescent moon. It's a wonderful vista. One thing Miyazaki and I seem to have in common is a fondness for these kinds of snow areas. As much as I love them, and believe me I do love them, I can still see that if the game had been nothing but snowy nighttime levels up to that point, the Irithyll reveal would have meant nothing. Just because it's my favourite kind of area doesn't mean I want the whole game to be like that. It's the surprise that makes it work. Another example would be Gwyn's theme in Dark Souls 1. You ask anyone who played Dark Souls and they'll list it as one of the most memorable tunes, but would it have been as good if the entire soundtrack was somber piano music? Of course not. It's the contrast with previous boss themes that makes it stand out. My point here is that even traditional boss fights stand to benefit by including others that don't fit into the same mold. When it's a foregone conclusion that every fight will be a dodge and punish affair, they lose their impact. Call it whatever you want. Restraint, pacing, surprise, variety, contrast, it's something Demon Souls has in spades which the later games lack.
Matthew goes on to dismiss bosses that, despite having unique and bizarre movesets that demand real-time strategy, and so on from the player, don't have a puzzle gimmick, meaning they are generic. And then he complains about unconventional movesets that require attention, and oftentimes creativity to be dealt with, and efficiently exploited. Since he makes a big deal out of Dark Souls 3 having generic bosses, I'll briefly summarize and analyze its roster to prove otherwise. Iudex Gundyr is a perfect introductory boss. Vorst is very simple. The Curse-Rotted Greatwood is fully gimmicky. The Crystal Sage is very gimmicky. The Abyss Watchers are in between a gimmick boss and a combat-oriented boss. They feature a novel and creative mechanic that's smoothly integrated into their fight. The Deacons of the Deep are a gimmick boss. Wolnir is a gimmick boss. When close to death, the Oath Demon King explodes himself in a last effort to defeat the Unkindled. This makes him pitifully frail for the rest of the fight. This quirk is reminiscent of Sif's from Dark Souls 1, which Matthew praised, yet it got no mention from him. If Sif is unique and gimmicky, so is the Oath Demon King. Sullivan is not a simple boss. He does attack you with strange timings, yes, but if you're attentive, he'll understand you can parry his attacks, or punish them in other ways, such as by running around him and so on. He's also got a clone mechanic that's wholly unique. The clone mirrors his movements in succession. Yarm is a gimmick boss. Haldrich is too bizarre to be called a conventional boss. He can teleport around, and he's got the infamous Rain of Arrows spell. The Dancer is somewhat conventional, I guess. Her moveset is rather strange. I'll count her as conventional regardless. The Dragon's Lair armor attacks you alongside a stage hazard, the Pilgrim Butterflies. Is it mostly conventional? Osiris is mostly conventional as well, though it's worth noting that he's the inverse of Ludwig. He turns into a savage beast. As he loses his humanity halfway through the fight, he kills the very baby he was boasting about, the Child of Dragons, which was invisible, like Priscilla, a similarly draconic hybrid. Upon switching phases, it's quite brutal. Champion Gundyr is rather conventional, but he's got a glaring weakness in the parry mechanic. Lorien and Lothric have two unique mechanics. Lothric teleports his brother, and in the second phase, continually revives him until he himself is felled. Somewhat conventional, but incredibly unique. The Ancient Wyvern is a gimmick boss. The first phase of the Nameless King fight is quite unique, even among fights against dragons. The rider hurls lightning spears at you, and strikes you with his spear, while the Drake spits fire. Its second phase is indeed an epic showdown against Gwyn's firstborn, Flann. Its second phase is conventional, yes, but it's among the greatest fights in the series. The Soul of Cinder can be called conventional, or combat-oriented, but it too is one of the most memorable, unique, and awe-inspiring experiences in the series. Sister Frida and Ariandel are half conventional, half gimmick. I have explained it before, so I won't repeat myself. It's also worth highlighting that the third phase of the fight is a very unexpected twist that deliberately subverts the expectations of the player. The champion's Grave Tender and his Great Wolf are more gimmicky than otherwise. Besides the fight itself, there's the fact that the Great Wolf acted as a sort of pursuer enemy, combined with a stage hazard throughout the DLC. The Demon Prince may be combat-oriented, yes, but like Frida, it's one of the most mechanically unique fights in the series, and incredibly complex. Half-Light is a gimmick fight. Midir is a phenomenal, but still decently conventional boss, although it too acted like a stage hazard before. And finally, Gale is a conventional fight, but once again, the build-up to his boss encounter is beyond unique and memorable. His fight does, however, have many unique quirks about it. Gale's usage of the White Soapstone to summon himself to catch the player off guard is very creative. His cape, which acts like an independent entity, is rather bizarre, and imposes a chip damage penalty if the player fails to account for it. The skulls that track the player require agile movements to avoid, and the Thunderstorm forces vigilant positioning. If Matthew considers bosses like the Old Hero, the Man-Eaters, and the Leechmonger to be unique, or quirky in some way, there are only 5 or 6 bosses in Dark Souls 3 that he shouldn't consider unique in that semi-arbitrary, mechanical capacity, and those are absolute fan favorites. None are basic combat encounters. How does Demon Souls have soul and uniqueness in spades, while the other games do not? The idea that the Souls games are dodge and punish, or roll and attack simulators is just a tired meme. yet Matthew took it as a literal description. That's like saying all action games are button mashing, and thus, mechanically dull, or that all platforming games consist only of running and jumping.
Catering to a larger audience has simply sucked more and more soul out of the series. Players whine about gimmick boss fights, so bosses become basic combat encounters and nothing more. Players want honourable PvP so they can test their skills against each other in a shallow, laggy, min-maxing backstab magic spam fest instead of having fun with the things you can uniquely do in these games, like disguise yourself as an environmental doodad before kicking an unsuspecting player off a cliff. Never underestimate a community's ability to take a cool feature and use it for the most boring thing imaginable.
Matthew then complains about Dark Souls 3 having a PvP arena. Why is it a bad thing? He doesn't even argue against its inclusion. He just mentions it out of left field. Because I guess anything that isn't a puzzle or a trap is bad if it's in a Souls game. The obnoxiously derogatory way he describes the PvP of Dark Souls makes me once again think of DSP's salty rants after he dies a lot at a game.
Players want convenience so they can fast travel and respec their stats, removing absolutely any and all tension wherever possible, just like every other RPG from the past 10 years. At some point, you just start to wonder what's next on the chopping block. Maybe the next game will have a built-in function to back up your save files, so you don't have to think too hard about any of those pesky decisions. If current trends keep up, sooner or later all we'll be left with is a generic blob of a game, enjoyed by everyone and loved by no one. Of course, the players don't actually make the games. You can't blame the audience for the decisions made by the developers, but it's a stark difference going from assumed failure to subcultural phenomenon. Bloodborne was the game Sony banked on to push the PS4 into the hands of early adopters. That kind of financial pressure is a breeding ground for design by committee homogenization.
Then he lists as bad mechanics fast travel and stat reallocation. I guess you can argue that they undermine the weight of certain decisions, or the game's tension at certain moments. I am inclined to agree that excessive fast travel and checkpoints can work to the detriment of the experience. The open world, and even the legacy dungeons of Elden Ring and the stakes of Marika aren't to my taste, for the most part. Though I don't believe anyone in their right minds would complain about stat reallocation. See, I don't think there's nothing worthy of criticism in From Software games. But what Matthew is doing is mischaracterizing a whole expanded franchise and arguing in bad faith.
As if this wasn't frustrating enough, the real twist of the knife is that even though the series has started to stagnate, it hasn't even managed to carry many refinements from one entry to another. Problems are regularly solved in one game only to be undone in the next one. Demon's Souls remains the most non-linear entry in the series and still has by far the most believable environments.
So, he complains that the games have changed too much into a direction he doesn't appreciate, and, simultaneously, that they are stagnant. And then proceeds to list an array of experimentations of various mechanics that change with each installment, because he'd have preferred stagnation, because he thinks that previous games had objectively superior versions of them, and thus the sequel should not try to do anything differently. Even for Matthew's standards, this segment is remarkably schizophrenic and contradictory. At the very least, Matthew attempts to substantiate a point, but the examples he provides are terrible. Demon's Souls is far from being the least linear game in the series. Dark Souls 1 is slightly more open-ended, Dark Souls 2 is significantly more. Bloodborne is just slightly more linear than Demon's Souls, and Dark Souls 3 is a bit more than Bloodborne, but they are far from being linear games. Only an experienced, risk-averse player says such things. The complaint about the believable environments isn't particularly valid, given the premise of the setting of each game. I will not dwell at this point at length, as I have already addressed it in my previous response to Matthew. Instead, I will play a clip from that video.
Even worse then, transitioning to the Dragon Eyrie reveals an obviously impossible set of outcrops in the sky which weren't visible just moments before.
Then he rants that the world of Demon's Souls is internally cohesive, while Dark Souls 2's is not, which, again, misses the point. As explained before, Dark Souls 2 takes place in a dream world, inspired by stories such as Alice in Wonderland, which is referenced multiple times, and the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadaf, which has also been amply referenced in the series, and also in games like Bloodborne. Dark Souls 1 and 3 feature some illogical scenarios as well, but in lesser quantity, and that is not in spite of internal coherence, but precisely because of it. Time and space are convoluted in the world of Dark Souls. This is not a cop-out either, but a carefully thought out characteristic of the world with powerful implications for its story, which I talk about in other videos. Dark Souls 2's attention to detail is astounding. Again, I have to direct you to my 3-hour-long video which talks about it in detail, as I don't want to make this video even longer by providing elaborate explanations and analysis of each character and area. I will, however, provide some examples of the phenomenon, which Matthew believes to be an unintentional flaw in Demon's Souls, also a game whose world has a dreamlike character to it, though to a lesser degree, in Dark Souls 1. In Dark Souls 1, the Arch-tree whose inside is the Great Hollow makes no logical sense. As we reach the Ash Lake, we can see that it is, essentially, one tree stacked on top of each other. We can't see the demon ruins, nor Nito's catacombs and the Tomb of Giants from the Ash Lake, which also makes no sense. In truth, when we travel downwards through the hollow, we are traveling through time and space simultaneously, and the Ash Lake is like an isolated dimension from a different timeline, like the kiln of the first flame at the end of the game, or the painted world of Ariamis, which is simply a painted memory of the ruins of Karim. In Demon's Souls, it makes no logical sense for the beach with the ruins of Merge to exist below the Nexus. In truth, it operates under the same magical logic as the kiln and similar areas in Dark Souls. It is a chunk of the world that was removed and confined to a pocket dimension of sorts. If you believe, like the rest of the internet mob who can't think for themselves, that the transition between the Earthen Peak and the Iron Keep is a mistake, you must also believe that the transition between Majula and Hyde's Tower of Flame is one as well, as the tunnel you've just walked through has sunk into deep water, and there seems to be no way out from within the area. And if you are stupid and arrogant enough to believe that, you must also think, like Matthew, that the developers of the game would have made the same mistake for the hub area of the game by modeling the ruins of Hyde, as seen in Majula, accidentally. Which leads us to Matthew's next argument.
There's a host of smaller issues as well, such as the Tower of Flame as seen from Majula, which is way out of position. As a result, the feel of Dark Souls 2 suffers heavily compared to the other games, which felt much more consistent in their geography.
In a comic display of ignorance, Matthew says the ruined vestige of the Tower of Flame, as seen from Majula, is way out of position, when it is not just out of position, it's almost entirely sunken in the water, and there is no bridge connecting it to the village. I'm sure the developers must be drooling morons, and it's not Matthew who's at fault for not seeing the obvious here. Imagine this guy reading Lovecraft and ranting about how the Mountains of Madness makes no logical sense.
Dark Souls abandoned the health reduction penalty, which removed the incentive to open yourself up to invasion if you weren't going to summon. As bad as that was, at least it got the hollowing mechanic right by only allowing players to go human at the bonfire.
Matthew cites a supposed regression of Dark Souls 1, while also recognizing it is more like a new, an alternative approach than a plain downgrade, meaning it's not a good example for his argument.
In later games, players can wait until they're at the boss fog before opening themselves up to the online, making many invasions pointless.
This is a rare moment, but I do agree with Matthew. I too think Dark Souls 1 handles the summoning mechanic better than its successors did.
The interconnected world of Dark Souls 1 is still unmatched, with Dark Souls 3 being more or less a linear progression from one end of the game to the other.
Dark Souls 3 is not a linear game. As I've said before, it's slightly more linear than Bloodborne, and Bloodborne is far from linear. On screen is a chart depicting the placement of bosses, which gives a good impression of how open-ended the game is. You can fight Frida as your 4th boss, and go directly to the Ringed City DLC. You can fight the Dancer of the Boreal Valley as your 2nd boss, and unlock late game areas. There are many optional areas, and some branching paths. You can, for instance, do the Cathedral of the Deep before the Catacombs or vice versa. You can do Anor Londo before the Irithyll Dungeon, or vice versa, and so on. Matthew consistently uses incorrect hyperboles and inflammatory language to negatively simplify and slander what he doesn't like, while doing the opposite to portray what he prefers. He barely argues beyond this throughout the entire video.
Yharnam is arguably the best, most intricate level design FromSoft have ever done, but it's squandered by the inclusion of fast travel from the start, same as both Dark Souls sequels.
How is Yharnam squandered by the inclusion of fast travel? There are only a couple lamps through Yharnam. Bloodborne's lamp system is almost a one-to-one replica of Demon's Souls' Arkstone system. Miyazaki said it himself, that Bloodborne is a mixture of Demon's Souls, and Dark Souls because of the Arkstone and the Nexus of the former, and the open world of the latter.
The resource management challenge of the Estus system was completely destroyed by Dark Souls 2, and while Bloodborne's Blood Vial setup is at least thematically appropriate, it's still mechanically inferior.
The Estus system was not completely destroyed by Dark Souls 2. The developers tried to create something different. Even if Matthew thinks the healing mechanics of Dark Souls 2 are inferior, he contradicts the primary point of his video by complaining that the developers didn't just reuse the Estus system of Dark Souls 1. As a reminder, Matthew has repeated again and again that the developers are afraid to innovate, or experiment, and take risks at all after Demon Souls. Regardless, I have refuted his points about the healing mechanics of Dark Souls 2 in my response to his critique of the game, but to summarize, the Estus system had certain issues such as their spammability, which paired with heavy armor, allowed you to face tank your way through the game in the cheesiest manner, and their overabundance once you acquires the Rite of Kindling. The Estus mechanic of Dark Souls 2 emphasized progression over convenience. You start the game with only one flask, and acquire more as you delve into areas, rewarding careful exploration and progress. The animation is lower and the healing is not instantaneous anymore, preventing cheese strategies. However, the player can vastly increase both its speed and its healing potential, once again, by upgrading his character through a stat that was useless in Dark Souls 1, but was reworked in the sequel, and exploring the game. Life gems work as a secondary healing mechanic. They heal over time, and can thus be used more strategically. I'm not saying Dark Souls 2 did healing better than its predecessor, nor that its attempt is flawless. What I am saying is that it tried something different, that did manage to fix some of the issues of the previous attempt, while introducing new ones. Matthew fails to realize this, and says the developers are incompetent, and should never have been in charge of making a Dark Souls game, in his characteristic smug, passive-aggressive tone. I do agree that the Blood Vial system, much like Demon Souls' healing mechanic, is not as good as Dark Souls 1's Estus Flask. Miyazaki tried combining the two, and perhaps add a survival horror spin to it, and the results were mixed.
New Game Plus is still bare bones, even though Dark Souls 2 showed that remixed enemy placements could provide a fresh experience.
Indeed, Dark Souls 2 did innovate with its NG+, also contradicting Matthew's original and primary point.
Bloodborne used charge attacks to fix backstabs without resorting to excessive enemy tracking, but then Dark Souls 3 abandoned the idea.
Bloodborne's backstab mechanic is not an improvement to those of Dark Souls. It is something entirely different that was designed with Bloodborne in mind. Backstabs, as they are in Dark Souls, slow down the pacing of the combat, and provide a brief respite to its tension. Those of Bloodborne were designed to only be usable through either stealth, or exceptionally careful and intentional positioning, as to not allow the faster-paced combats to be interrupted so easily. That does not make Bloodborne's backstab superior. Matthew's complaint about the backstab mechanic in Dark Souls 2 and 3 does not make any sense, given it was precisely and deliberately addressed. The issue he points out does not exist in those games. Dark Souls 2 introduced an intermediary animation between the backstab input and the backstab itself to make them harder to perform. It did not kill circle strafing entirely, nor should it have done so, but it did nerf it and force the player to be more intentional and skillful with his backstab attempts. The same is true for Dark Souls 3, only its enemies, including the one Matthew shows being backstabbed on screen, have attacks specifically designed to punish poor backstab attempts, as well.
Ashen Estus is my favourite addition in Dark Souls 3, but at this point I fully expect it to be inexplicably dropped. Next time around we'll probably be back to a weird Blood Vial setup or something equally disappointing.
Matthew finally says something positive again, and I agree. The Ashen Estus mechanic is pretty good, though I still don't think it is an objective improvement over the attunement and Mercury Bullet mechanics of previous titles, and his prediction was wrong. Elden Ring did preserve it.
Keep in mind, these are just the problems FromSoft actually bothered to address at some point. There's a whole host of issues that have never even been looked at. The camera is still atrocious when unlocked during combat because it does nothing and occupies the thumb you use to press the roll button.
The camera is not atrocious when unlocked. Matthew is just bad at managing it. Taking away the player's freedom as he suggested wouldn't be a good solution. I much prefer having full control over the camera when not locked on.
Lock-on still breaks during boss fights even though there's nobody else in the room, and the button still snaps the camera behind the player when it's not in range, with no option to disable it. I've played hundreds of hours of these games and I've never once actually wanted to use the button for that.
The lock-on breaks very rarely. This is just a nitpick. and the camera snapping is not an issue. It would be nice to have the option to disable the feature, but that's it.
Weapons still bounce off walls even though enemies glide right through, giving them an unfair advantage.
Dark Souls is not a game like Devil May Cry. It doesn't have open, empty arenas that serve as sandboxes for hacking and slashing. It would be nice if the developers were able to devise a miraculous solution to this issue, without breaking other mechanics, though.
Critical attacks still don't work properly on slopes.
True, I guess From Software could design 2 new animations for each weapon type for their next Souls game, so that enemies can be backstabbed and reposted while above or below you. Once again, there is no easy solution to this problem, and it's not a big deal.
Input buffering is still overzealous and sometimes feels inconsistent, a minor annoyance in the early games but completely unacceptable for something the speed of Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3.
Input buffering is simply not an issue, and it is not inconsistent. Just get good. There I have said it.
Enemy pathfinding is still embarrassingly wonky, leading to exploitable or unpredictable movement patterns, and enemies can still be leashed, defeating the purpose of the entire combat system.
Enemy pathfinding is not embarrassingly wonky. Once again, Matthew portrays a minor issue that's really hard to solve, and which no other similar games have managed to fix satisfyingly, as if it were a big deal.
If these games are going to be iterative sequels, at the very least they could be good at that, but they're not. 5 installments is more than enough time to figure out what makes these games good and iron out the kinks. Many other series have come a lot further in fewer tries.
The only somewhat valid issues Matthew points out in the entire video are nothing more than minor nitpicks, but that makes masterpieces like Bloodborne bad sequels, according to Matthew, and his terrible taste and judgment. And to top it off, as expected, he does not say which series did much better in fewer tries. With each From Software release, the entire gaming industry is shaken, and gaming companies try their best to replicate, or create something inspired by the innovations it brought to the table. After Dark Souls came out, many games tried to emulate its bonfire mechanic, and its interconnected world. After Sekiro came out, every other game tried to replicate its parry mechanic. Sekiro, by the way, entirely discredits the already meritless and bad faith arguments Matthew espoused in this video. From Software is still creating new trends, and will continue doing so. Night Rain was a wholly unconventional title, which nobody expected, and which took plenty of risks, and was far from being universally praised, even by longtime fans of the company. Yet it exceeded all expectations of financial returns, and garnered a cult following, and Duskbloods will expand upon and refine its idea, while certainly bringing many innovations, like Dark Souls did to Demon Souls. And I presume companies will try and copy this new formula in the near future as well.
With all that said, it's finally time to take a shortcut back to my point from the beginning. Demon Souls is one of those rare, genuinely innovative games that did enough new things its influence can be clearly felt on the gaming landscape of subsequent years. That originality is one of its best qualities, but it would be unfair to expect every game FromSoft creates to be innovative. The more important thing about Demon Souls is how cohesive it is. It's FromSoft unfiltered, free to pursue an overarching design methodology even if that results in some unpopular decisions. That's what I want for every game developer. Games are more interesting when they're unshackled by the expectations of a narrow-minded fanbase or the financial whims of a publisher. Right now it feels as though these games have fallen victim to one or the other, maybe both. Whatever the cause, recreating the superficial elements of Demon Souls isn't enough to make a truly great game by itself. It needs more. The magic of Demon Souls lies under the surface. It's a culmination of ideas and concepts that work together in unity to accomplish something greater. That's not to say it's perfect. In fact, it seems pretty clear that it wasn't even finished before it was released, but the end result is a game that proves you can have it all. Haunting visuals, immersive environments, evocative sound design, satisfying gameplay, novel mechanics, intriguing storytelling, memorable characters, fun multiplayer, and a high level of replayability. They're not mutually exclusive goals. Games don't have to be one or the other. When you do it right, you can do it all. It may not be the best at any of those things, but what it offers instead is a complete package on a level that is arguably unmatched. Unfortunately, over time, FromSoft decided to focus on some of those elements at the expense of others, and as a result, those games are more easily eclipsed by others which do those things better. Demon Souls still stands tall because it knows what it is. A demonic soul with a heart of gold.
Matthew's positive description of Demon Souls can be applied to every single one of its successors. And this is the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support my work and get access to a Substack-like blog in which I post analysis of the Bible and religion more generally, and of literature, films, music clips, manga, anime, other games and more, feel free to subscribe to my Patreon. By subscribing to it or by becoming a member of the channel, you also get access to an exclusive Discord server in which you can talk to me directly. Again, thank you for watching, and I hope you have enjoyed the video.